At an upscale cafe in the heart of the city, a hungry black teenager lingers just outside the patio, his worn hoodie and tired eyes blending into the background. But when he witnesses a wealthy socialite slip a mysterious liquid into her husband's soup, his instincts scream danger. Ignored by the crowd and dismissed as a nobody, the boy faces a choice: walk away or speak up. What no one expects is that his courage will shatter the facade and expose a deadly secret hiding in plain sight. The midday sun bathed Golden Terrace in a warm glow, casting soft shadows across its polished stone patio. Nestled within Rosewood Park, the cafe exuded an air of elegance, its wrought iron tables adorned with crisp white linens and crystal glasses that sparkled under the light. The soothing murmur of a nearby fountain blended with the clinking of silverware and hushed conversations, creating an atmosphere that felt untouchable by the troubles of the outside world. Waiters in tailored vests and pressed trousers moved gracefully between the tables, balancing trays laden with artisan dishes and delicate pastries. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread drifted through the air, a gentle reminder of comfort and indulgence. It was a haven for the city's elite, a sanctuary for those who measured their worth by designer labels and exclusive invitations. But for Jamal Brooks, a black teenager, this place might as well have been another planet. He stood just beyond the cafe's patio fence, half hidden by the trimmed hedges lining the perimeter. His hoodie, once black but now faded to a dull gray, hung loosely over his thin frame. His jeans were frayed at the knees, and his sneakers, mismatched and stained, looked as though they'd walked 100 miles too many. Jamal shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to ignore the hollow ache in his stomach. The cafe's rich smells teased him, each whiff a cruel reminder of how long it had been since his last proper meal. He shoved his hands into his pockets, fingers brushing the few crumpled bills he'd managed to collect that morning. Not enough for food, not in a place like this. At 14, Jamal had already seen more than his fair share of hard days. His mother had died when he was 10, leaving him with a father who drank too much and cared too little. By the time he turned 12, he'd been on his own, sleeping in shelters or under bridges, surviving on scraps and luck. But despite it all, Jamal had learned to observe, to watch people, to read their movements and intentions. It was how he stayed alive, and today that habit would prove more valuable than he could have ever imagined. At the cafe's center, seated at a table draped in pristine linen, was Richard Hale. Even among the well-dressed crowd, he stood out, a man whose presence commanded attention. His tailored navy blue suit fit perfectly, and his silver hair was neatly combed back, complementing the sharp angles of his face. Behind the gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, his eyes carried the weight of years spent building and defending an empire. Richard Hale wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. The kind of man whose name appeared in headlines and who moved through the world as though he owned it. But today he didn't look invincible. His shoulders sagged ever so slightly, and he moved with the deliberate caution of someone trying to mask fatigue. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at his phone, his brow furrowing, as if the messages he read only added to his exhaustion. Across from him sat Elena Hale, the very picture of sophistication. Her long dark hair cascaded in glossy waves over her shoulders, and her red dress clung to her figure like it had been tailored for her alone. Diamond earrings sparkled at her ears, and a matching bracelet caught the sunlight as she reached for her glass of sparkling water. Elena looked every bit the trophy wife, her smile polished and practiced, but her eyes told a different story. They darted toward Richard's phone, then back to her plate, betraying a nervous energy that didn't match the calm she projected. Jamal's gaze lingered on the couple. He couldn't explain why, but something about them felt wrong. It wasn't the way they looked, they were perfect, flawless even. It was the way they sat together, close enough to share a table, yet miles apart in everything else. Richard barely glanced at Elena, and she seemed more focused on her reflection in the polished silverware than on her husband. Jamal might have turned away then, might have left them to their world of designer clothes and three-course lunches, but something caught his eye. Elena's hand slipped into her handbag, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She pulled out a small glass vial, no larger than a travel-size perfume bottle. Jamal squinted, his stomach flipping as he watched her twist the cap and tilt the vial over Richard's bowl of soup. The liquid, clear and unremarkable, disappeared into the creamy broth without a trace. Jamal's breath caught. He froze, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd just seen. Was it medicine? Some sort of seasoning? But no, her movements had been too careful, too secretive. And then came her words. Elena leaned forward, her voice low but sharp enough to reach Jamal's ears. After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now. Richard didn't seem to hear her. He was still staring at his phone, distracted, oblivious to the danger sitting inches from his lips. Jamal's heart pounded. He looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The waiters glided past without so much as a glance, and the other diners were too absorbed in their own conversations to care. For a moment, Jamal hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if he said something and embarrassed himself, or worse, got arrested? People like him didn't belong in places like this. They didn't get the benefit of the doubt. But then he looked at Richard again, older, slower, completely unaware. And Jamal made his decision. He pushed past the low hedge and strode toward the table, his legs trembling but his resolve solid. Voices murmured as people noticed him, but he didn't stop. When he reached the edge of the table, his voice came out louder than he expected. Don't eat that. The cafe fell silent. Forks clattered against plates. Heads turned. Richard froze, his spoon hovering just above the bowl. His eyes snapped to Jamal, wide with confusion. Elena's expression hardened, her hand tightening around the edge of the table. What the hell do you think you're doing? She snapped, her voice sharp and cutting. Jamal didn't flinch. She put something in your soup, he said, his voice shaking but clear. I saw her. For a long moment, no one moved. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath, caught between disbelief and curiosity. And then Richard set his spoon down. Slowly, deliberately. Elena, he said, his voice low but steady. What is he talking about? The stage was set. The truth was about to unravel. And Jamal, hungry, scared, and completely out of place, had just started something no one in that cafe would ever forget. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he set the spoon down beside the bowl. His sharp, calculating eyes flicked from Jamal to Elena, searching for answers in the tension that thickened the air around them. The clinking of silverware and quiet hum of conversation had vanished, replaced by an uneasy silence. Every pair of eyes in the cafe was fixed on their table. Jamal stood rigid, his heart pounding so loudly he swore it echoed in his ears. Sweat beaded at the back of his neck, but he didn't step back. He had made his move. Now he had to stand by it. Who are you? Richard's voice, though calm, carried the weight of authority. It wasn't a casual question, it was an interrogation. Jamal swallowed, but his voice didn't waver. My name's Jamal, he said quickly. I saw her. He pointed at Elena, his finger trembling but firm. She poured something into your soup. I saw her do it when you weren't looking. Elena shot up from her seat, her chair scraping against the stone floor with an ear-piercing screech. This is absurd, she hissed, her face flushed. Are you seriously listening to this? She turned toward the gathering crowd, arms raised as if rallying support. Look at him. He's just some street kid trying to stir up trouble. He probably wants money. Jamal flinched at her words, but he didn't back down. I don't want your money, he said, louder this time. I just don't want you to die. His voice cracked, raw with desperation. Richard's eyes narrowed. He looked from Elena to Jamal again, weighing their words. Years of business deals and boardroom battles had honed his instincts, and something in the boy's voice rang true. Elena, he said, his tone quieter now but laced with suspicion. What's going on? Elena's composure faltered for just a moment, a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she recovered quickly. I can't believe you're even asking me that, she said, her voice sharp and defensive. He's lying, Richard. He's obviously trying to scam us. Why are you even entertaining this nonsense? But Richard wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the bowl of soup in front of him. Slowly he leaned closer, inhaling carefully, his brow furrowed. Elena, he said again, this time with more force. Answer me. Her mask cracked. This is insane, she snapped, her voice rising. Are you seriously going to trust him, some dirty kid who probably hasn't showered in weeks, over me? Your wife. The words cut, but Richard didn't flinch. Instead, he raised a hand, gesturing toward a nearby waiter who stood frozen in place. Get the manager, he said firmly, and call the police. No. Elena's voice hitched, and for the first time, the cracks in her facade spread wide enough for everyone to see. You can't. Sit down, Elena. Richard's voice was calm, but it left no room for argument. Elena's face paled, and she slowly sank back into her chair, though her fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Jamal felt his legs go weak, but he stayed standing. He had their attention now, but the weight of their gazes bore down on him. Tell me exactly what you saw, Richard said, his focus shifting back to Jamal. Jamal took a breath, steadying himself. She took a small bottle out of her bag, he said, his voice slower and more deliberate this time. It was clear like water, but thicker. She poured it into your soup when you were looking at your phone. Then she stirred it so you wouldn't notice. Richard's gaze darkened as Jamal spoke, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he turned to Elena, his voice quieter now but no less sharp. Elena, is it true? Her lips parted, but no words came out. Is it true? The silence stretched. Elena's chest rose and fell rapidly, and for a moment Jamal thought she might break down, but then she did something no one expected. She laughed. The sound was sharp and brittle, tinged with hysteria. You're all crazy, she said, shaking her head. This is ridiculous. You actually believe this little rat? But no one else was laughing. The other patrons whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Elena and Richard. The weight of their judgment was palpable. The sound of sirens cut through the tension, growing louder as they approached. Elena's head snapped toward the street, her breathing quickening. You called the cops, she said, her voice high and shrill. Richard didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his expression blank but his eyes hard as stone. 2 police officers stepped into the cafe, their uniforms crisp and their presence commanding. The manager hurried over to greet them, gesturing toward Richard's table. Over here, the officer in front said as they approached. Thank you for coming so quickly, Richard said, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling around him. This young man, he gestured to Jamal, says my wife put something in my food. Elena bolted from her chair. This is insane, she shouted. He's lying. I didn't do anything. The officer raised a hand, signaling her to calm down. Mom, we're going to need you to stay seated and let us handle this. Elena opened her mouth to argue, but the officer cut her off. Sit down. She obeyed, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. The second officer leaned down to examine the bowl. We'll need to take this in for testing, he said. No. Elena blurted out, and the cafe erupted in whispers again. The first officer raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed? Elena's lips trembled. Her gaze darted toward Richard, then to Jamal, and finally to the crowd that surrounded them. Her perfect poise crumbled. Her voice faltered. I didn't mean for it to go this far. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the betrayal finally settled. Jamal stood motionless, his chest heaving as the officer stepped forward. Ma'am, one of them said, pulling out handcuffs. You're under arrest for attempted murder. Elena's scream pierced the air as the officer grabbed her wrist and snapped the handcuffs into place. You don't understand, she shrieked, struggling against the steel cuffs. Her diamond bracelet jangled against the cold metal, a harsh contrast to the polished image she had so carefully maintained. He's lying. He's lying, Richard. You know me. Richard didn't move. He sat frozen, his gaze locked on the woman he had once trusted, once loved. But now, all he saw was the desperation in her eyes and the venom in her voice. It was as if the carefully constructed mask she had worn since the day they met had finally shattered, revealing the truth underneath. Take her outside, the officer said firmly, motioning for his partner to assist. No. Elena's voice cracked as the officers tightened their grip. Her heels scraped against the stone floor as they began to pull her away. You can't do this. I did it for us, Richard. For us. Her words hung in the air, echoing across the cafe like a confession that couldn't be taken back. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder as phones appeared, recording every second of her downfall. For us. Richard's voice, though quiet, cut through the noise like a blade. He rose slowly from his chair, his towering presence commanding the room's attention. His hands rested on the table, knuckles white. "You tried to kill me, Elena." Elena twisted in the officer's grip, her eyes wild. "You don't understand," she spat. "You were supposed to leave it all to me. You're old, Richard. You don't even care about the company anymore. You." Enough. The single word silenced her. Richard's voice didn't rise, but it carried the finality of a gavel hitting wood. Elena's shoulders sagged as if the weight of her actions had finally hit her. She stopped fighting and allowed the officers to lead her toward the door. But as she passed Jamal, her eyes locked onto his sharp and unforgiving. "You ruined everything," she hissed. "You think this makes you a hero? You're nothing." Jamal flinched, but the fury in her voice didn't touch him the way it might have before. Not anymore. Instead, he held his ground and met her gaze, his voice steady. "I saved his life," Jamal said. "That's more than you ever did." Elena's mouth opened as if to respond, but the officers pushed her through the door before she could speak. The sound of the cuffs rattling against her wrists faded as the door swung shut behind them, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Jamal felt his knees wobble, but he stayed upright, even as the adrenaline began to drain from his body. The room seemed to exhale all at once, and the quiet hum of voices returned, softer now but still buzzing with disbelief. Richard turned back to the table, his shoulders sagging. He ran a hand down his face, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily on him. Jamal expected him to yell to demand answers, or maybe even blame him for causing a scene. But when Richard looked up, his eyes were softer than Jamal had ever seen them. "You saved my life," Richard said, his voice low but steady. Jamal blinked. He shook his head, unsure of what to say. "You didn't have to do that." Richard's voice carried the weight of genuine gratitude. "You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you. But you didn't." Jamal opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. No one had ever looked at him like that before, not with admiration, not with respect. He wasn't used to it. "I couldn't let it happen," Jamal finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair across the table. "Sit." Jamal hesitated, glancing around at the other patrons who were still staring. But something in Richard's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Carefully, Jamal pulled out the chair and sat down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Richard leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Tell me, Jamal, how long have you been living like this?" Jamal's shoulders tensed. "Like what?" "Like you don't have a place to go." Jamal's eyes darted away. "A while," he muttered. Richard didn't press, but his gaze softened. No one should have to live like that, especially someone who's willing to stand up for what's right. Jamal shrugged, the weight of his circumstances pressing down on him. "It's not like I had a choice. I couldn't watch her hurt you." Richard nodded, as if the simplicity of Jamal's words said more than any elaborate explanation ever could. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I know someone who can help," Richard said, typing quickly before lifting the phone to his ear. "A friend of mine runs a shelter downtown. It's not just a place to sleep, they help kids like you get back on their feet. Education, jobs, whatever you need." Jamal's stomach twisted. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly. "I wasn't." "You weren't asking for anything," Richard interrupted. "I know that, and that's exactly why I'm offering." Jamal looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the table. No one had ever offered him anything without expecting something in return. Trusting people had never been easy for him, but something about the way Richard looked at him, like he actually saw him, made Jamal's walls start to crack. "Okay," Jamal said quietly. "I'll go." Richard smiled, a small but genuine expression that seemed to ease some of the lines on his face. "Good. Hard." Before either of them could speak again, the waiter approached with the check, clearly unsure of how to navigate the aftermath of the chaos that had just unfolded. Richard waved him off, leaving a stack of bills on the table before turning back to Jamal. "Let's go," he said, standing and motioning for Jamal to follow. Jamal hesitated for just a moment before rising from the chair. As they stepped out of the cafe, the air felt lighter, as though the storm had passed. For the first time in years, Jamal didn't feel invisible. And as he walked beside Richard, he let himself believe just for a moment that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change. Jamal followed Richard out of the cafe, his shoulders hunched and hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn hoodie. The noise of the crowd inside faded as the glass doors swung shut behind them. But Jamal still felt their eyes burning into his back. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible, and yet he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the cobblestone path that wound through Rosewood Park. The fountain nearby gurgled softly, its rhythmic splashes filling the silence between them. Jamal kept his gaze fixed on the ground, his scuffed sneakers brushing against fallen leaves as he walked. Beside him, Richard Hale strode with purpose. Even after the chaos inside, he carried himself like a man who owned the world, or at least had built enough of it to act like he did. But Jamal noticed the slight tremor in Richard's hands, the way his breathing seemed just a little too controlled, like he was trying to hold himself together. "You okay?" Jamal asked quietly, surprising even himself with the question. Richard paused mid-step, glancing at Jamal with a flicker of surprise before letting out a dry chuckle. "I should be asking you that," he said, running a hand through his silver hair. Jamal shrugged. "I'm used to people yelling at me." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "That doesn't make it right." He stopped walking and turned to face Jamal, his sharp eyes softening just enough to make the boy uncomfortable. "You shouldn't have had to step in like that. I didn't see what was happening, but you did, and you did something about it." Jamal shifted his weight. "Anyone would have." "No, they wouldn't." Richard's voice was firm. "Most people would have looked the other way, especially in your position. But you didn't." Jamal didn't know how to respond to that, so he just stared at the ground. Richard exhaled and gestured toward a nearby bench under the shade of a tree. "Let's sit." Jamal hesitated but eventually followed, sinking into the seat and stretching out his legs. Richard sat beside him, but the space between them felt deliberate, respectful, rather than intimidating. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jamal traced patterns on the stone path with the toe of his sneaker while Richard gazed at the fountain, his expression unreadable. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "I didn't see it," he said, almost to himself. "I had no idea what she was capable of." Jamal looked up, unsure if he was supposed to say something. Richard didn't seem to notice. "I thought we were happy," he continued, his voice quieter now. "She was God, she was perfect. Or at least I thought she was." He rubbed his temples, as if trying to erase the memory of Elena's voice echoing through the cafe. "But somewhere along the way I stopped paying attention." Jamal frowned. "You couldn't have known." "Maybe not." Richard turned to face him. "But I should have." He paused, his gaze searching Jamal's. "You saw something no one else did today, including me. How?" Jamal hesitated, unsure how to explain it without sounding crazy. "I watch people," he said finally. "It's how I stay safe. You can tell a lot about someone if you pay attention to the little things, the way they move, what they look at, what they hide." Richard studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's smart." Jamal blinked. "It's not smart. It's survival." The words hung in the air between them. Richard seemed to weigh them carefully before leaning back against the bench. "You shouldn't have to live like that," he said after a moment. Jamal stiffened. "I can handle myself." "I don't doubt that," Richard said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But you shouldn't have to." Jamal looked away, but Richard didn't press him. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. "Let me make a call." Jamal's stomach tightened. "To who?" "To someone who can help," Richard said simply. He held up a hand before Jamal could protest. "Not out of pity. You earned this, Jamal. You earned my trust and my respect." The words hit Jamal harder than he expected. He didn't trust easily, but there was something about the way Richard said it that felt real, like he meant it. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, still unsure if he should let himself hope for something better. What if it doesn't work out? Then we'll figure something else out. Richard's voice left no room for doubt. "You're not alone in this anymore." The words hung there, heavy with meaning. For the first time in years, Jamal felt the faintest flicker of relief. Richard stood and gestured for Jamal to follow. "Come on," I want to introduce you to someone." Jamal hesitated but rose to his feet, following Richard as he led him toward the edge of the park. As they walked, Jamal stole one last glance back at the cafe. The crowd had thinned, but a few lingering patrons still stared after them, whispering and pointing. He felt the weight of their curiosity but forced himself to look forward. Today had changed something, maybe everything. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Jamal was willing to find out. Jamal followed Richard down the shaded path that led out of Rosewood Park, his footsteps hesitant but steady. The weight of everything that had happened still clung to him, as if stepping away from the cafe's polished world would somehow make it all unravel. He kept glancing back, half expecting Alina to burst through the doors, screaming accusations and clawing for control. But the cafe remained as still as the fountain beside it, quiet and contained, as though the chaos had never happened. Richard, on the other hand, walked with the steady determination of a man who had made up his mind. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low but authoritative as he spoke to someone Jamal couldn't hear. Jamal's fingers twitched in his pockets, brushing against the frayed seams of his hoodie. Part of him wanted to bolt, to vanish before whatever promises Richard was making became too real to back out of. But another part, the part that had fought to speak up, that had refused to look away when it mattered most, kept him rooted to the spot. Richard ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "They're expecting us," he said, glancing at Jamal. "It's just a few blocks from here." Jamal's stomach churned. "Who's they?" "A friend of mine runs a Foundation New Beginnings shelter. It's not just a roof over your head. They'll help you figure out school, work, whatever you need to get back on track." Richard paused, then added, "No strings attached." Jamal bristled instinctively. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Richard replied firmly. "It's a fresh start, and you've earned it." Jamal's lips pressed together, his defenses flaring despite himself. "I don't know how to do any of that. School, jobs, none of it." "You didn't know how to do what you did today either," Richard countered, "but you did it anyway." Jamal looked away, the words settling uncomfortably in his chest. No one had ever talked to him like that before, like he was someone worth believing in. It scared him more than he wanted to admit. The shelter came into view at the corner of a quiet street, its brick softened by vines climbing up the sides. A small sign above the entrance read "New Beginnings" in clean, hopeful lettering. Jamal slowed as they approached the door, his pulse quickening. Richard stopped and turned to face him. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice calm but steady. "But I think you should." Jamal looked up at the building, his eyes scanning the windows and the warm light glowing from inside. He didn't know what waited for him on the other side of that door, but he knew what waited if he turned back: cold nights, empty stomachs, and people who looked past him like he wasn't even there. He took a breath and stepped forward. Inside, the air was warmer than Jamal expected, carrying the faint scent of coffee and clean linen. The lobby was small but inviting, with worn couches and a table stacked with books. A woman behind the desk looked up and smiled. "Mr. Hale?" she asked, standing as Richard approached. "Yes," Richard said, gesturing toward Jamal. "This is Jamal Brooks. I told you about him." Her smile widened. "Hi, Jamal. I'm Tessa, the director here. We're really glad you're here." Jamal shifted nervously, his eyes darting around the room. Hi," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Tessa didn't miss a beat. "Don't worry," she said gently. "We'll take things one step at a time." She motioned toward a side door. "Why don't we sit down and talk about what you need?" Jamal hesitated, glancing back at Richard. Richard nodded encouragingly. "I'll be right here if you need me," he said. Jamal swallowed hard but followed Tessa through the door. The sun hung low over Rosewood Park, bathing the fountain and cafe in soft golden light. Jamal sat at a corner table on the cafe's patio, his hoodie replaced with a clean, button-up shirt that felt foreign but strangely comforting. He poked at the edge of a croissant, his fingers still fidgety despite the calm setting. Across from him, Richard sat with his sleeves rolled up, sipping coffee as he scanned a newspaper. Every so often he glanced at Jamal, as if checking to make sure the boy was still there. "You're sure you're okay with this?" Jamal asked, his voice quieter than usual. Richard folded the paper and set it aside. "Okay with what?" With all of it, Jamal said, gesturing vaguely. The shelter, the classes, helping me out. I mean, you don't even know me. Richard smiled faintly. I know enough. Jamal raised an eyebrow. I know you're brave, Richard continued. I know you're sharp. And I know you stood up for someone when most people wouldn't have. Jamal shifted in his seat. I didn't do it for this. I know, Richard said simply. And that's exactly why you deserve it. Jamal didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and took a sip of his water. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said, I was wrong about something. Jamal frowned. What? When I first saw you, I thought you didn't belong here, Richard said, glancing around the cafe. But I was wrong. You belong anywhere you decide to be. Jamal felt the words settle deep inside him, filling a space he hadn't realized was empty. Thanks, he said quietly. Richard's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen and sighed. Work calls, he said, standing and pulling a few bills from his wallet to leave on the table. But this isn't the last time we're meeting. Jamal grinned for the first time in what felt like forever. Better not be. Richard laughed, clapping him lightly on the shoulder before heading toward the exit. Jamal watched him go, then leaned back in his chair and let the moment wash over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. For the first time, he felt like he had a future worth chasing. And this time, he wasn't running from anything, he was running toward something better.